everyone, and congratulations on getting up after that rousing game of trivia last night. Oh wait, it was 7 rounds, Tony, wasn't it? Wow. Good morning. Let me begin by acknowledging we are on the traditional, ancestral, and self-governed lands of the Tsawwassen people, and it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Joanne Archibald, Kompong PM, who will give the inaugural Garnet Grosjean Lecture. And for those of you who didn't know Garnet, he served as the academic coordinator of the EDD program from 2001 to 2021, so 20 years, and shaped both the EDD program and the Institute significantly, which is, why Tony referred to him last night. Garnet passed away quite suddenly on January 31st of this year, just a few years after his retirement, hence the Garnet Grosjean Lecture, so named after him. Dr. Joanne Archibald is not only a very treasured colleague in EDSD, and we miss her, she is currently also Chancellor of the University of the Fraser Valley, Professor Emerita in our department, and former Associate Dean, Indigenous Education in our faculty. She is a member of the Stolo Nation and well known for many contributions to Indigenous education at various levels. Perhaps foremost for Indigenous story work, which elaborates storytelling as an Indigenous approach to education grounded in Indigenous traditions. In 2018, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada for her lifelong contributions to Indigenous education in K-12 and post-secondary education. I also remember personally that one of my first opportunities to see really, really good teaching at the post-secondary level was when I observed your teaching, and it was then, he's now retired, Shel Rubinson, had the foresight of saying, let's get a really junior assistant professor involved in a teaching observation for a report on teaching. And I had a chance to observe Joanne. And instead of this being service, Shel reminded me, said, we don't actually see each other teach very much. We don't watch each other teaching as much as would be great. And so I had a chance to observe Joanne teaching. There's a special chemistry that, it was wonderful to watch. Dr. Archibald's talk this morning is titled Indigenous Stories of Education as Resistance. Please join me in welcoming Joanne Archibald.
Well, it's great to be here with you and on Tsawwassen land. We had a bit of a coyote journey this morning getting here, but I got here just like coyote somehow eventually gets to where they need to be at. So I'm really honored to be asked to give the inaugural Garnet Grosjean Lecture. Garnet has a very special place in my heart and in my EDD experience that I always value the support, the collegiality of Garnet, and the program grew and thrived from his leadership. And today I'm also so pleased that there are members of the 2002 cohort here, or around that time of the EDD. Maybe it was, my dates may not be correct, but 2001. Okay, maybe I didn't teach till 2002, I'm not sure, but that was my first teaching experience in EDD with that cohort. So that was a special experience for me and a wonderful introduction into the EDD program. So today I'm going to tell various stories, and these are two of them are personal experience stories of mine, and then I'm going to share a traditional story about Coyote the Trickster, and then end with, maybe it's part of a story, it's really an unfinished story, you might say, about some reflections and lessons that I learned about resistance. I love the theme, education as resistance. So I'll start with these dear elders whom you see on this slide. They were part of what's known as the Kokalitsa Elders Group. I'm a citizen of Stalo Nation. I grew up on Sewali or Thawali community, and Thawali is part of Stalo Nation. Stalo are people of the river. And when I look back, reflected on my childhood as an adult, I really grew to appreciate the childhood that I had. That the Sewali community was small. Maybe when I grew up, maybe there might have been 150 people living in that community. And, a lot of, there were the Kellys and the Commodores and the Mussel family, basically. And what I remember growing up was that I had lots of freedom as a child to be able to play by the creek, in the forest, go into the fields, and always playing with my cousins. And I always felt safe because my older cousins always had to look after me and my sisters because we were the younger ones. So if we were ever afraid of anything, it might be meeting a bear. And we still have bears in the community today, in fact. But it was a time where perhaps that's where I developed my strong connection to nature. To be able to spend time, just days, in the summer anyway, playing outside, and I will be home for dinner, and then I remember though going to school, and I went to public school. My mother went to residential school, to the Kamloops Indian Residential School, but my father actually went to public school, and I always wondered how that happened, that he and one of his brothers were able to go to public school, because at that time there was a law that First Nations kids had to go to Indian residential school. But that idea of going to school, for me, that was kind of in the mid-1950s, going into the 60s through high school. I always felt like I lived in two different worlds. I lived in the world of Sewali, of the community, tight-knit family in a way, tight-knit but extended family. And then the world of school, which was so different than what I knew at home. And not to say there weren't problems in the Sewali community, because there certainly were, but in the community I felt valued, I felt loved. In school, it was just different. There was, of course, nothing that I remember being proud of in the school, where I would learn about being Indigenous. And in fact, when I got into high school, I sort of cringe inside whenever we might learn about then Indian people in the textbooks. They're presented as stereotypical, as warring people, as having, the Indian problem. So I never felt that I could identify with the Indigenous representation in school, because that's not what I knew. I just knew that our families really cared for us, that there were ceremonies that I went to as a a teenager and then as a young adult that I valued and that I didn't quite understand, but after attending different ceremonies, I learned the importance of them. And then I went to UBC and completed my teacher ed program. But in that program, again, there was nothing in the program about Indigenous people. And probably I was maybe relieved after my high school experience. But what I did, though, was that for course assignments, I often completed them using Indigenous topics. And I'm not sure why, but there was something that made me in a way that that's what I wanted to do. And often it was fine. There was no issue from my professors. But it was in when I took some anthropology classes, and there were a couple that were about still the term Indian, but Indian history, especially in BC, that I took. And it was that time that I began to realize colonial history. You know, there were some aspects there was one book in particular about Stalo people, and it presented some of the traditional teachings there, but it also got into some of the issues about the Indian Act, about Indian residential schools. And I had heard about residential schools growing up, and once in a while people would talk about them, but not very often. But it was through that educational experience that I began to understand that impact. And I even think at that point we weren't using, as we do today, the term colonization. But I really then started to maybe understand that impact on Indigenous people of having culture and language denied, having children taken away from the family. And in my own teaching then, there were opportunities that I took to then introduce my class to Indigenous topics and approaches that I wanted to share with the students. So maybe when I started teaching, would be in the kind of early 1970s or so. You know, there might have been in grade 4 where one could use social studies to introduce something about Indigenous people. Eventually, I returned home to Stalo area and taught with the Chilliwack School District. And I loved teaching, and I was a primary school teacher, and I taught grade 2s and 3s. And at that time, I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to live happily ever after being a primary school teacher. It was tough at times, but yet I loved the interactions with the young people, young students. And it was at that time when I was back in Stalo territory that I began to attend programs that were offered by Kokalitsa Cultural Center. And I enjoyed those, like basket making, tanning deer hides, and then there were Halkamilam language classes, and that's the language of Stalo people. And another very important program was related to Kokalitsa Elders Group. And these dear elders, who you see in this picture, were members of that group, and in the late 1960s, they started meeting as a group. And they began a cultural revitalization movement in Stalo area, where they took on the responsibility of documenting the Halkomelem language. At that point, it had been mainly oral, and there wasn't a written language. So they created a written language, written form for the language. And they also decided that they wanted to work on school curriculum because they felt it was important for Stalo children to learn about Stalo history and culture because they had lived through that, denial of culture and language through colonial laws and policies. But for them, they kept that Indigenous way of knowing, being, and doing alive in their hearts and in their minds. Some of them, I've heard other elders say, they put those to sleep during the years that they, where the laws forbid them to practice all of this. But they decided it was time to reawaken those knowledges, and particularly the Stalo stories, because they had grown up with stories as a way of learning, as a way of living. And they felt that those stories could be very helpful in education. They also believed that it was important for all children attending the public schools to learn the same history. And at that time, the Stalo children mainly attended the public schools. There were 2 First Nations schools in 2 First Nations communities, but the other Stalo children attended public school. So my role then, after a while, I moved into a position which then was called Indian Education Coordinator for elementary schools. And that was a position where I could work with teachers and, of course, communities and families on matters of concern for both. But with the elders, they wanted educators to help them. And so, lucky me, I was able to participate. And so I attended their weekly meetings. And that's important that the elders, ever since they started being a group of elders, they met in the late 1960s, and they'd meet once a week, and one member would cook a meal for everybody else, and then they would talk about whatever business they needed to. And that has continued on till today. There is still a Kokalitsa elders group, with many descendants of these elders shown in the photo. But at that time, I was able to sit in on those elders' meetings. And a lot of the time, when I started this involvement, it was sort of the late 1970s, early 1980s. And the elders spoke a fair amount of Halkomelem in their meetings. And I learned a little bit that way, but I was appreciative that they were able to do that. But then, over time, a number of those fluent speakers sadly passed away. And then, of course, newer elders started to join, but then the language then switched to English because there weren't so many fluent speakers anymore. However, they still talked about Stalo culture, history, and language, and they still continued to work on curriculum and other projects that would come before the group for them to determine what they wanted to work on. You know, I share this experience as an example of resistance, where those dear elders resisted, you know, becoming assimilated. They resisted those attempts at cultural genocide over the years. It's not to say it was hard. Yet they still managed to keep a fair amount of the core part of, you know, Stalo knowledges, to keep those alive. And that was the importance of them being together as a group, because one person, for stories, could remember parts of a story, but they couldn't remember others. And somebody else would say, oh yeah, I remember that. You know, and so together, some of the stories they were able to collectively bring one story together. And they then worked with another Stalo artist, and the artist drew pictures, and in that process, we very carefully ensured that those of us documenting the stories, our responsibility was to ensure that the elders approved of their story as it was represented in text and in images. And that took a while to do that process, but it was so important. But now I reflect on that work, and today in this talk I could say that was a form of resistance. The resistance to colonization, and it's also a resistance to exclusion, because the elders did this because there was nothing positive that was being taught in the schools about Stalo people, which reinforced what I went through. So they decided as a group that they would do something about that. And so one outcome was the development of a number of stories and an elementary school curriculum where the teacher's guides were developed, and at that time we used an inquiry approach. Now just think, that was in the 80s. Well, today inquiry is still a big deal in K-12 learning as it is elsewhere. You know, and that these dear elders were also practicing truth and reconciliation way before TRC's report came out. Now, these stories were used for a number of years in the schools. Now, this would be, you know, through the 1980s, maybe the early 1990s. And then of course, K-12 curriculum changed over time. And these books and it was a multimedia curriculum at the time, but all of those materials, I think, were left in a box, put in a closet. Teachers didn't use them anymore because maybe, I think we heard teachers felt the materials looked outdated. They weren't fancy, you know, colorful books or any other new media being used at the time. But more recently, a few other Stalo educators and I decided that, you know, those stories are timeless. You know, we could find a way to revitalize the use of the stories, not to change the stories, because those were the elder stories. But what we could change was the way students were learning with these stories. So the last 4 years, I've been working with educators in the school districts ranging from Coquitlam, New Westminster to Hope. That's all in the Big Stalo area. And what we're doing then is to help mentor teachers to then be able to draw on these stories in a way to get them story ready. Now, going on to story 2. Some of these stories I could go on and on, but I need to move so I can go through all my stories today. But I thought, well, I'll share a bit of my own personal graduate student experience. And for me, I was teaching in the Chilliwack School District and working as the Indian Education Coordinator for a few years. And then I felt it was time for me to learn more. I felt I was ready to engage in a master's program. And so I did enroll in a MED program. And this worked for me because, again, I was working full-time. And this was a program offered evenings and in summer so that I could take part. And in this program, it was like my high school in K-12, nothing in the program, the coursework about Indigenous people. And for me, I guess the only way I could respond perhaps was through my capstone project to ensure that I focused on an Indigenous topic area. So I developed a case study on the Stalo curriculum and working with the elders, and that was my capstone project. And with this experience, I learned much more through archival research, about the Indian residential schools that operated in the Stalo territory. And I also was able to learn, too, about some of the protests. It was more of a written form that the Stalo leaders enacted, and where they wrote letters to the federal government, to Indian Affairs at the time, voicing their concern about the conditions of the residential schools, about the treatment their children were receiving, and that they wanted improvements made, and they didn't want their children going to residential schools. So there was a lot of that, and I valued that opportunity to undertake archival research, to learn more that way. And then I then became involved in a wonderful teacher ed program called NITEP. It was started in 1974, just celebrated the 50th anniversary last year. And NITEP, acronym for Native Indian Teacher Education Program. So even though NITEP has kept that acronym, but it's become a name, not so much an acronym, because so many people identify with NITEP, the program. Just like I think EDD, there are people who've been involved or went through EDD and have, such a close connection to the program. Well, that's how NITEP students have felt. And there have been talks over the years to change it because we're not using Native Indian anymore, but then it would lose the name of NITEP. So now it's UBC NITEP, UBC's Indigenous Teacher Ed Program. So there are ways to be able to still keep what is near and dear to a group, one and to a group, and still address, some current issues. But it was in my teaching and my work with NITEP, and that helped me appreciate, again, another form of resistance. Resistance to a program that the teacher ed program generally did not have any courses in it that were Indigenous. This is when NITEP started. And there were maybe a handful of Indigenous teachers in the province. But they formed a small group, and they figured it's time that we increase the numbers of certified Indigenous teachers in the province of BC. And they chose UBC as a Faculty of Education to work with. And there was then a non-Indigenous ally who worked with this group. And they created NITEP. And as you know, for university programs, it takes a lot to get it through the UBC system, Senate, and then the province. But they persisted, and they were able to get NITEP approved. And it was not easy. There was resistance from others who thought, why would you need such a program? And is it going to be as good as the existing teacher ed program? But it was the leadership, actually, of the dean of the time who kind of ignored that and pushed that proposal through. So sometimes it does take courage, to stand up to injustice in order to move, something forward that's very important. And, NITEP today has a number of Indigenous education courses. When the program first began, at least 2 years were completed at their home territory, and then they came to UBC campus. Of course, there are changes now where there are some NITEP cohorts that can now take their program fully in their community. But you think 50 years, it's very recent, this being able to take the program in a home community. But it's commitment, persistence, working together. I think that results in some substantial educational improvements. Now, I digressed a bit. I was going to talk a bit more about my graduate student experience, but I combined, because when I was taking my master's, I was also working. So, the two are very interrelated. But I then finished my master's, and a few years later, I was working full-time for NITEP. Then as a coordinator for the Chilliwack NITEP group, because we had a center in Chilliwack. And in 1985, I became the director of NITEP and moved to Vancouver. And it was there that, spending 5 years or so there, I thought, well, maybe I'll stay at UBC because I valued NITEP. Thought maybe I'd continue working with NITEP forever. But I realized if I was to stay at UBC, I needed that doctoral credential, right? So I looked around and I found a PhD program where I could still work and take my courses. And again, in that program, it was the same thing. Nothing in the coursework related to Indigenous people. So I was able to take a directed studies course that focused on that area. And of course, in the classes, I did speak up. I did say, I remember one of my student colleagues saying, Joanne, I remember you always saying, from an Indigenous perspective. I guess that's what I said in the courses. So at least to have a little voice in that area. But again, I completed assignments focused on Indigenous situations. And then, of course, my PhD research was focused on Indigenous research. And at that point, I made it was a conscious decision, which for me was my small act of resistance, where I wanted to ensure that the research that I undertook was Indigenous-based research. You know, at those early times, our big controversy in our courses related to, you know, the tensions between qualitative and quantitative research. I mean, that's quite a while ago, and Indigenous research wasn't even, you know, no one really wanted to talk about it. But I decided that's what, if I was going to be in academia and do this research, I would focus on an Indigenous way. And then I placed that book in the library. Because I thought, well, others would go to the library and look at that. You know, that was my thinking at the time. But now, years later, I'm appreciative that for some reason that was important to me. That was my individual act of resistance. It was something I could do. And I was able to return to those wonderful Stalo elders and learn from other elders too. You know, I already had a relationship with the Kokalitsa elders, so returning to them felt like going back home. You know, and I asked if they would help me with my PhD research, and they said yes. And they helped guide what I did, you know, and I valued that. And at that point, you know, I was thinking about Indigenous stories. And through my work with the elders, what seemed important to me was the question of how can we make meaning with and from Indigenous stories? You know, because that part was hindered, taken away from Indigenous people. Because I felt a lot of our stories, especially the traditional stories, weren't valued for their educational purpose. And I felt they were powerful for education, for an individual, for heart, mind, body, and spirit of the individual. And so I went on my research journey. But as a good PhD student, of course, I looked at other forms of methodology, you know, and seeing, you know, what might I be able to use. You know, I was drawn to ethnography, even though there's lots of issues about ethnography and also anthropologists and how they took knowledge away and didn't return them, and lots of mistrust that Indigenous people have about research and outside researchers. But I felt that was coming close to what I wanted, but didn't quite work. Then I was drawn to critical ethnography to kind of ask some of those important questions about power relations. And that helped, you know, but wasn't quite right. You know, so I just decided to spend the time learning from storytellers, from cultural knowledge holders, from elders, from listening to stories, to then finding ways to draw on these stories in educational settings. So it was an experiential process, being guided a lot by those who knew about stories, so that it eventually became an Indigenous methodology. And I feel that that was, again, my act of resistance. However, I could not do that alone. It meant that I had to ensure that I continued my relationships with elders, with Indigenous people. You know, that in some of the work that I did involved development of other curriculum, and that meant working with educators and other Indigenous people in BC, where they would contribute or loan the story for this curriculum. So I also included a bit of case study of those curricula. But that took time. But for me, that's what I needed to do. That was my choice, to take the time that was needed. So in the end, I was able to develop a framework called Indigenous Story Work. And the 7 principles are listed here. And I'm not going to go into these today, but I would hope that if you're interested, you can look at my website, you can read, or you can listen to the audio version of Indigenous Story Work, Educating Heart, Mind, Body, and Spirit. Now, my third story. One of the folks who helped me on my journey, my PhD journey, was Dr. Eber Hampton of the Chickasaw Nation in the U.S. But Eber had, and still lives in Canada, and had worked, you know, at First Nations University and University of Regina. But one time he told this story, and eventually he gave me permission to adapt the trickster to my context. And so I want to share this story with you. So I just want you to, as you are, just relax. You don't have to take notes for this one. Let your imaginations have a little fun. You know, our coyote, our tricksters, coyote being one, can transform into many shapes, and it could be different characters. And coyote kind of often gets in trouble because coyote forgets about the good teachings or forgets about responsibility. And that's why I like coyote so much, because I can rely on, you know, coyote stories sometimes when I have a bit of a difficulty or need a bit of humor to help me through. So, even though this is coyote searching, it's really the character I chose is called Old Man Coyote. So one day, Old Man Coyote woke up, looked in the cupboard, and saw that all the food was gone, and realized that it's time to go hunting. So that Old Man Coyote got his hunting bag together, put stuff in it, and went out, and hoping to catch some deer. So he walks and walks, goes up hills, down valleys, along the creeks, in the fields, most of that day. Not very lucky, doesn't see anything. So it's getting near towards the late afternoon, and he figures it's time I set up camp. So he finds a nice little clearing in the woods, sets up his camp. Sitting down, he lights a fire, nice small fire. And then as he's sitting there, his feet are feeling sore from all that walking. So he takes out his moccasins from his bag and puts them on. And that would make him feel better. And as he looks at his moccasins, he notices that there's a hole in the toe of one of the moccasins. So he figures it's a good time to sew up that moccasin. So he reaches into his bag for his bone needle. And you're feeling around, but you can't find it. So then, now it's nighttime and the fire's going really nicely, it's nice and bright, and if we were looking at him, we would see old man Coyote down on his hands and knees, going around that fire, feeling for that bone needle, just going round and round, feeling for the bone needle. And then he hears the voice of Owl saying, Coyote, what are you doing? And Coyote tells the owl that he's looking for his bone needle. And she says, well, I'll help you. So she makes a swoop around that campfire and finishes and tells him that it's not there. And she says, where were you when you last used that bone needle? Coyote thinks, oh, I was off in the northern direction. And Owl says, Coyote said, I would have found the needle if it was here, but you keep going round and round this fire. And you know it can't be there, but why do you keep going round and round the fire? And old man Coyote says, wow. He said, it's so nice and warm and light, there's light, and it's easy to look for the bone needle here. So I'm glad you find that bit funny. So that was old man Coyote searching for that bone needle. Now, when I heard that story, I was thinking, wow, that bone needle, wonder what that could be like. You know, and our stories, you know, they may not always have a nice tidy ending, and often that's the way, and that's kind of a signal for someone who's listening to become part of the story. You know, for me, I guess I could think that, yeah, that bone needle was kind of the research approach, the research methodology that I'm searching for. You know, but going round and round that fire is what I experienced in my graduate education courses. Various kinds of methodology that were known, that were promoted in particular disciplines, you know, but they really weren't what was relevant to what I needed as far as the way I needed to address my research inquiry. You know, and there are other meanings that, of course, could come from that story. And I'm hoping we have a bit of time. I'm going to try and keep going a little quicker now, so that if you are able to share a thought about the story, I welcome you to do that. You know, but I you know, just was thinking too that the owl, you know, the owl could be like a critical friend, there to help us, maybe to guide us, maybe to ask us questions. You know, and I just had a thought that Garnet Grosjean was like that owl for EDD. You know, he was there to truly support the program. But there are times he could ask those questions that, you know, there are times when, you know, graduate studies has different policies that they want, you know, you to follow, and maybe EDD needed something different. Well, Garnet wasn't afraid to stand up for EDD, stand up for the students. But I believe he also stood up with folks, the leaders in Ed Studies. So together they could create, you know, important policies and approaches relevant for EDD. Okay. So, reflections. When I was thinking about resistance, so I shared, you know, my educational experiences going through public school, through my undergrad, through my master's, through my doctoral program, where there was either nothing or very little in those structured programs about indigeneity. And I know that's changed, and we'll get into that. But at that time, as me, Kwang Kwang Huyan, or Joanne, as a student, I did what I could at that time. For me, it was ensuring my assignments were Indigenous focused. Being able to speak up in class when I had the opportunity. But not being afraid to back down though, you know. And so maybe there, I don't know, something inside of me said I needed to make a change because I felt it wasn't quite right what was happening. But I also then had experienced the elders' love and their teachings and their support, those Kokalitsa elders who formed a group to work together. And that's what I have valued over my career at UBC and in education at all levels. You know, that need to be able to find a group to work with. That group having one heart, one mind. Doesn't mean we agree, of course. You know, it's good to have the disagreements, but we have the one heart where we have that commitment to improve something. And I believe that both individual and that collective cooperation can help us take a big leap. Along with having, for me, Indigenous teachings and values. For me, appreciating my Stalo culture, my Stalo ways of knowing, being, and doing have helped me, have helped nourish me, especially in times where it's been difficult, and helped guide me. And I wasn't sure really which way to go, or if I was really sure I could use those teachings. And that over all these years, they've sustained my heart, mind, body, and spirit in how I have developed and to help guide and sustain educational actions. And I would encourage each of you to find your own teachings, your own values that come from your cultures, or your families, or your communities that will help you move forward. And also for my reflection and a lesson is that I've always felt it's important to make systemic change. So trying to change a policy, especially in an educational system, create a program. For me, those are examples of systemic change. That means that change could continue. Even though, of course, I know people make systems and people change things, but it's a bit harder once you have an established program, especially one that's been going for 50 years, maybe. So today when I look at what's happening in education, I can feel good because if we look at K-12, there are in each grade level subject area, teachers must address the First Peoples principles of learning to include indigeneity in their teaching practice. I have 2 First Nations grandchildren attending K-12. And I just want to tell about my granddaughter, the bragging. Recently she was, she's 10, and in her school for Orange Shirt Day, one of the teachers organizing it asked her, Sawyer, and she's named Kwam Kwam Huyan, number 2, and asked her if she would, share some words on Orange Shirt Day. And when Sawyer told me this, I says, oh, what did you say? Because I wasn't sure how she'd respond. She says, yeah, I said I'd do it, sure. And so we talked about what she'd say. And she wanted to highlight, and she knew the picture she wanted to show that was of her great-grandmother, my mother, and she's the one who went to residential school, and Sawyer knows this and knows the impact, and then me, of course, her mother and Sawyer, so the 4 generations. So she figured out what she wanted to say, and I went to her presentation, and it was wonderful to see this 10-year-old feeling confident. It was her 4 grades in her school, and she had pictures, and she was able to talk about reconciliation and the meaning of reconciliation. And then she ended with a song, and she loves to sing, and she wanted to sing the Woman Warrior song. So she had her little drum, and she sang that song, and I think, my goodness, look at that. So to me, that's positive and shows, a positive impact, where Sawyer's proud to be Indigenous, proud to be Stalo, and proud to share what she knows. So I feel that even though there are many issues about trying to enact the TRC calls to action, more inclusion of indigeneity, it has positive effects. And that important notion of resistance that came from elders, that come from my generation, resistance to colonization, resistance to being assimilated, resistance to being excluded. I think, today I value what we have. And we have a lot more to do. And I know that individually and together, we can do a lot more. And I think it's always important to remember, in the sense of why we're resisting. What are we resisting to? And then how are we going to do it? So I leave you with those thoughts. So thank you for listening, and I'm hoping maybe somebody will share a thought about Old Man Coyote. Maybe I'll open it there. If anybody has a thought about Old Man Coyote, please.
Thank you, Joanne. My name's Alana Williams. I'm from the 2012 cohort. And when you mentioned the story and then you talked about Garnet, and so what came into my mind was how Garnet asked me a question during the comps. He was the owl. And I had just finished presenting and telling a story of how I got lost in the middle of a rainstorm on my first day in the program, and thinking, oh, I've made a huge mistake in coming to this program and doing this. But so he asked me, sorry, my brain's going to be kind of all around the place here, but in our first Ed D program or class, I met Hannah Arendt, right? And so I had this really deep knowing that I had to use her work in my research. And so I embarked on a philosophical inquiry, and I had no experience with philosophy at all. My background was very technical, very much in around that fire. And Garnet said to me, you seem like someone who likes to be really organized. So why did you choose a philosophical inquiry where the outcome is unknown? And I'm like, that's a good question. And so what it turned out was that philosophy, the encounter with Arendt, showed me where my resistance was. And I kept coming up against this inability to find my way when I didn't know where I was going. So I was getting lost in my writing. I ended up suffering a breakdown. And then I had a spiritual awakening. And so now here I am, 7 years after my breakdown, and I have discovered the divine in Hannah Arendt's work. And so that's where I'm at. And I'm very close to finishing my first draft and being finally through this incredible transformative experience. So I guess what I would pass along, what I learned from that old man coyote and that willingness to kind of go beyond the fire is to pay attention to where the resistance is, because it holds up a mirror to where our great learning and growth can be, both personally but also systemically. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One more comment. Yes.
I'm just the connection that I made. I'm married. I was at this little gal's events. I'm currently working at BIU. We're still working at BIU. And BIU's going through some changes right now, some financial difficulties. And I just made a connection with Coyote looking for that bone around the fire because it was easy. So we're having, and thinking of the presentation we had yesterday from the company keynote around those difficult conversations and budget cuts and things like that. Like, it's quite easy. I've thought about Coyote circling around the same budget documents. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, that's the easy place to go. How do we now, like, institutionally or go to a place to those difficult conversations, those ethical spaces, and maybe shift a little bit and go beyond the fire. I can't say I can think of who the owl is right now. But anyway, that's the connection. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both for sharing your personal experiences and having courage to go away from the fire, and also knowing fire can give us comfort at times, and we can return there. And I know it's break time, so thank you very much for listening.
For always thought-provoking stories and lessons, but always in a way that will take time to resonate. And I think for many of us it won't be until we're driving home, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, that things will come back and we begin to realize. And so I thank you